Okay, so guys, for today's lesson, we're going to be looking at how Bollywood is constructing and deconstructing gender. So what we're going to look at is how Bollywood is kind of maintaining the cultural values of gender in India, and as well as how it's kind of following a shift in perceptions and a shift in values in mostly what women's roles are and kind of how they should behave and look in India. So, gender roles in India, as we know, India is a relatively conservative society and it's a mostly patriarchal society. So, they have very strict gender roles within India and they kind of follow the general lines of the male breadwinner and the female homemaker. And so, the idea is that men are the ones that are meant to go out and work. And earn money for their family, and women are meant to be what are considered inferior, and so therefore they're expected to care for their family and husband's family once they were married. So just like in Afghanistan and a lot of other conservative countries we've looked at, as soon as the woman was married, she would go and live with her husband's family, and then she'd be expected to care for them. And then, like I said, the man would be expected to get a good job and support the family. Because of all of this and the fact that men were kind of the driving force economically for the family, they practiced female infanticide, which is essentially choosing or purposely killing female babies when they were born or when they were aware that they were females, in order to not have a female child and then create room for having more male children. And this is also because, as well as families, if you only have women as kids, when they get older, you're going to have no one to look after you because they're all going to go and live with their husband's family. So not only can they not financially support you, but then you've got no one to look after you once you're older. So yeah, female infanticide was a massive practice in India. And also because of this, because the women weren't really seen to be valuable in terms of getting an education, they would tend to support their sons in education more than they would support their daughters. So because of this, and as we know, Bollywood is meant to, or any popular culture is meant to reflect the culture so that it remains relevant. Because of this, Bollywood definitely constructs gender. And so male dominance and existence in the meso and macro world is very much reflected throughout almost every Bollywood film. So pretty much every Bollywood film we're going to watch, except for Queen, kind of follows that kind of ideal. It definitely follows the boy meets girl scenario, with usually the hero, heroine, and a villain as opposition to their romance. So we can see that in Student of the Year, you can see that in Lavage Carl, you can even see that in Humpty, where it's following the male lead character's desires to get with a certain girl, and especially in Lavage Carl, the old reflection of Veer in his life back in India and how he pursued Kareen. Is it Kareen? Oh, yeah, the older lady in India. You know, he pursues her. It's not necessarily. It's kind of almost like she eventually gives in to him. We don't really see what her desires are. We see him constantly following her until she kind of gives in and wants to be with him. That's a very common scenario in terms of courtship in Bollywood and India. We follow the male's desires and the male's needs, and then he kind of courts her through following her and almost aggressively trying to win her over until she does eventually follow or fall in love with them. And as we see a lot of the time as well, the female characters in Bollywood and the gender roles that are represented in that is usually through the homemaker, carer, and they tend to be fairly dependent on men or are generally just shown as objects of male desires. So we don't necessarily get to see what the desires are of women in the show. We only get to see their desires in relation to the male story. So if you think back to like Lavage Carl, the modern couple, we only really hear what her desires are in relation to what his desires are. So how he wants to go and work in San Francisco, and so we also hear how her stories of career, um, and we generally follow his life. While she is a part of the story, we're following his life, his struggles, his concerns, and then how she kind of fits into that story. And this is also, again, enhanced through Bollywood's focus on the male hero and his life and desires, dreams, aspirations, tragedies, as well as revenge. Um, and so that kind of that continuing focusing on men in that kind of uh, meso macro sphere, and women and their relation to romance and family. That's, whilst we might see them in the meso world, it's not to the same extent as the men, and that's kind of maintaining that gender role of women being the more domestic, focused on carer and nurturer, rather than the men who are focused more on career aspirations and those kinds of things. And so yeah, so therefore they kind of assert gender through, gender is kind of constructed and maintained and perpetuated through the assertive active male lead and the passive and submissive female lead. So yeah, as we've seen through a lot of these kinds of films, women only exist in the family male lens. They don't exist in their own lens. So Bollywood stories very much construct gender through the way they characterize men as being these active, involved, aggressive kind of characters, and women being the submissive, following the desires of the men, and really not kind of following their story as much as following the men's story. Again, there's also these kind of, we're seeing now, to kind of fit into the more modern conception of gender in India and around the world, especially tying into the diasporic experiences as well. We're seeing kind of two dichotomies of female characters in Bollywood cinema. So the first one is seen as the traditional, the virtuous Indian woman. So she's chaste, virtuous, submissive, and traditional in her values. And the thing to kind of take note as well is women in India are kind of really seen as this like beacon of Indian culture, the way they dress, the way they behave, and the strict gender roles that kind of placed on them. And so they're really lauded as being representative of Indianness and Indian culture. And so this kind of virtuous woman, which is really represented in Love Ajkal with the older woman in back in India, is kind of lauded as this ideal Indian person, and they're kind of characterized into those certain characteristics, and they kind of don't go outside of that. And then you've got, on the other side, you've got the other woman, which is the modern, wayward, reckless, and irresponsible woman. So definitely correlates with that Indian identity and loss of Indianness. So in terms of what they're wearing, the fact that they're working, their generally sexualized clothing. And usually what happens throughout the story, which definitely happened in Love Ajkal as well. So as we initially see, the more modern woman at the beginning of the film, she's definitely wearing more Western clothing. We see her in work, we see her involved in that kind of stuff. And then as the film goes on, you might notice she then starts to wear a little bit more traditional Indian conservative clothing, and kind of stops existing in the meso world as much. We don't really see her involvement in work as much anymore. It's more focusing on her romance and her entanglements with both of the men. So she becomes a little bit more traditional in that sense. And yeah, and then in the end, they usually find their way by becoming the more traditional heroine in the stories. That tends to be how that storyline plays out. It doesn't always, and we are seeing, as we're going to see, a shift in that. But even if the second woman doesn't kind of follow the more traditional view, they're still constructing gender roles in that sense, because they're kind of painting there's these two women. You're either this virtuous, traditional, wonderful woman, or you're a Western modern woman, and there's kind of no in between in that sense. So they're still very much constructing gender roles through that. And so through that kind of projection of one woman being really great and the other kind of losing her way, and then throughout the story finding her way and becoming that traditional conservative, chaste, submissive woman, they're definitely perpetuating those traditional Indian gender, because it's represented through that goal that this is who women should be and how they should behave. And then I'm just going to quickly read you an excerpt from Gender Reflections in Mainstream Hindi Cinema. So just as this academic has said, such family-oriented films essentially talked about family bonding and has women playing larger-than-life roles centered around values like love, care, discipline, and obedience. So those kind of core characteristics are really getting into the core values of India in regards to women and their roles. We definitely see women in a more caring, nurturing kind of role, and definitely as an obedient, whether it's they're listening to their father or their brother or the man that they're in love with. We're definitely seeing them kind of play out the desires of men in their family, right? Not necessarily their own. However, there is a shift. So India is undergoing a process of modernisation, which has kind of been since around the 1990s. So in 1992, India embraced the free market and globalisation, which has led to a growing middle class. So it's definitely in a growing and rapid process of modernisation at the moment. And because of this growing modernisation and the establishment of a growing middle class, being a housewife or a homemaker is no longer the aspiration of many wealthy middle class women as well as poor women in India. These concepts of modernisation are increasing, and so women are kind of reassessing their role in society and kind of demanding a greater participation in the workforce and in education. And so, because of this, we're seeing young women having greater access to education and careers, as well as birth control to their previous counterparts. So, there's definitely increasing birth control rights, as well as career opportunities and working rights, as well as access to education. So, because you're seeing this shift, and I want to stress that this is a slow starting at the beginning kind of shift. This is by no means the majority view. Yes, women are wanting it and are having a greater participation in career, but it's not necessarily changed their perception of gender roles. However, in saying that, there is still a shift. And so because of this, and as we know, Bollywood wants to, as a popular culture, appeal to the masses by seeming current and being up to date with current values and ideas. Bollywood is beginning to reflect these shifts. So it is, to some extent, deconstructing gender as well. We can see this through the past 5 years mostly, as the way women are represented in Bollywood is changing. They're kind of moving away from those two dichotomies of virtuous and modern, and that are kind of submissive to the male desires. And we're starting to see greater involvement of women in the storylines as well. So clear examples of this, as we're going to see Queen in 2014 and also Mardani in 2014, they are perfect examples of the shift that is occurring in Bollywood. And what I want to point out is Queen and Mandani are like the extreme representation. So they're kind of out of the norm in the sense of representing the shift in how Bollywood is representing women, but the way in which these women are represented is definitely kind of showing where Bollywood is going. Elements of these films can be seen throughout some of the other Bollywood films being made now and into the future as well. So the reason why Queen and Madani are so different to many other Bollywood films is that the male lead is the storyline's not about him at all. It's mostly about the women, and it really follows their lives and their struggles rather than the males, the male characters within the story. So Queen especially upsets this axis of passivity and activity. So the axis usually of the male activeness and the female passivity is kind of switched. And that's because the male character is not active in the storyline. Like, as I said, we don't follow his life, we don't follow his struggles, his desires. We see his desires, but they're only in relation to Rani, the main character's desires in her life. So we really follow her life and in kind of her struggles and her issues rather than following his. And so because of that, Queen definitely challenges previous Bollywood notions of the two dichotomies of characters, like I was saying. And this is especially the case because, as we're going to see, Rani starts off as being the virtuous, submissive woman, and then as the story goes along, she grows into this modern, active woman who doesn't submit to the family desires as well as the male desires. So it definitely flips that dichotomy on its head and no longer projects, or in the film it doesn't project the virtuous submissive woman as being the ideal woman. In fact, it also it almost projects it as being undesirable. And so, in that sense, definitely challenges the gender roles within India as well as the gender roles previously presented in Bollywood. Like as I said initially, though, it is very important to note that India still remains a very patriarchal, conservative society. So, yes, there is a growing middle class. Yes, there is growing involvement of women in the meso world and even in the macro world, and their desires and perceptions of their roles in society are changing. But it's only very early stages of change. And so, because of that, we're still seeing the maintaining of focus on the male lead. In saying that, though, like I said, we are seeing shifts, not to the same extent as Queen or Madani, but we are seeing shifts in the sense that women are starting to be shown as existing in the meso world more, and we're growing in seeing their desires. So yes, they're submissive, but not to the same extent as they were in previous Bollywood films. So it is slowly deconstructing gender and perceptions of gender, especially in the sense that it's challenging the ideals that there's only these two kind of personalities for women, either virtuous or modern. So it is shifting whilst also continuing and maintaining gender roles, especially for men in terms of their aggressiveness, active participation in the workforce, and supporting their family.